Alrighty, well, thanks for joining today, everyone. Some major changes this morning this week. So I renamed the org, and I apologize for the link breakage with major version change breakage, but we're widening the umbrella, the big circus tent here to make sure that this isn't just about the Open API. This is about async API and the other specifications. So I was getting feedback from folks that I know who are wanting to talk async and other specs, other beyond API, JSON schema especially too. And so we're widening the toolbox. There's quite a few things that have happened recently that kind of changed this that I won't go into detail on here. But if you want more detail, feel free to ping me personally, and I can give you a kind of quick dive and dump on what's going on. But with that said, nothing changes. We're still working on how we can generate more demand and attention for API specifications in general. Open API, async, JSON schema, Postman collections, any that we can get on the table that are relevant. Having working sessions with the RAML folks this week, so definitely widening the tent. And for those who are just joining on the video call, the GitHub repo is our central place. You can find that at API Specification Toolbox now. We have a home repo that captures everything that's going on with the group, weekly office hours, and we're using GitHub issues as kind of the central place for how we're tracking things. And with that, let me open it up. How's everyone doing? What's cooking this week? Anybody work on anything interesting that they want to share?
Hey, Sir Kin, but the main organ repo is still the same?
No, had to change the org, so it's API Specification Toolbox.
Oh, okay, okay.
Apologize for that. I will.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, makes sense.
I think that actually that change is really good because I've been I haven't posted anything anywhere actually because maybe due to the change or something I lost the repo or lost the place where I was supposed to put stuff, but actually I was looking into the questions that we were talking last time, so yeah. The short videos and the questions and I was skimming through Stack Overflow and a few other places and Twitter and stuff, and I kind of got ideas of how to get the questions, but also I got into the problem of exactly this kind of range of specifications. So because people are posting stuff related to Swagger, like not OpenAPI, but they're using term Swagger, they're using a lot of different things that kind of come up to the specification. And then when I started explaining, writing an explanation on, for example, what is the difference between OpenAPI 2 and 3, which is actually a very kind of coming up all the time question, I kind of ended up into this RAML stuff, because my personal belief is that OpenAPI 3 is finally getting to the good stuff that was in RAML all along. And kind of then that comes down to the kind of comparing the specs, and then that would be a little bit awkward unless we have kind of a wider range there.
Agreed.
So yeah, I came to the conclusion that we can talk details, but how those questions could be sourced, but that there are also issues. So that's my take now.
I agree. I think I'm working on a proposal with GitHub to talk about their OpenAPI spec, but we're going to be talking about GraphQL as a heavy part of it. So it's really changing the conversation from OpenAPI versus GraphQL to OpenAPI and GraphQL. And so having that GraphQL part of this conversation, there was just many conversations that where people were like, well, that's an OpenAPI discussion. I don't want to bring my GraphQL to it. And I'm like, oh, well, no, it's actually a much wider tent now. So.
Yeah, that was what we discussed last time, so that's kind of a good thing too. So.
Yeah. Well, and if we're going to make a major version breakage, now's the time I think to do it early on rather than later when we got more links and more people involved. So you brought up questions. I'll share the little bit that I worked on regarding questions. I actually started finding an interesting rhythm to it where what is OpenAPI as a basic question. I just went ahead and dove in and answered it and just threw up a basic. I think this one ended up being about, I won't play it, but ended up being about 3 or 4 minutes. I think I did one that was about 7 minutes. I was like, man, that's too long. It's got to be shorter. And so I walked through the spec in 3 or 4 minutes and answered. And then I did a second one on how do you convert from Swagger 2.0 to 3.0 and just use Mike's Ralphson's API converter to do that.
A simple
Whoops,
walkthrough.
don't want to actually play it. Turn down the
Yeah.
volume.
I was also doing a few videos. Well, kind of I was so busy this week that there are more mock-ups, but I was actually thinking, because of all kinds of advertisement and social media reasons, I was thinking that there could be like 30-second video, which would be like the really short intro, and then possibly a little bit longer one. Because for those people who really don't know what is an open API, I have a video that I possibly could even show, but like the short version is I took the answers from last week's discussion and I kind of concise it to it is a documentation method and standard for APIs, but it is also the standard, like technically, that applications can talk to each other about API, but then it's also that social contract that we were discussing, that kind of between people about how the API is supposed to work. And so that I could fit easily either with like a spoken video or like a talking head video, or with like a more kind of just graphical stuff into 30 seconds. And I think that could be the approach to take, at least to some of the stuff.
I agree. I like the short format. I'm super, and for me, I'd like to keep evolving these. Like what is Open API? I want to keep trying to make my video better and evolve it and get it down to that short, sweet, concise 30 seconds. But then I want to encourage other people. Like, even though I answered this question, I want 10 versions of this. And if someone can make one that's more informative and more relevant, then awesome. So what are you thinking about the Stack Overflow and that? Do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking, because I looked at the data, and as usual, the data is kind of crappy. So what I was thinking was that you need to kind of tag the data. So I was taking the kind of API approach into it and planning to use Stack Overflow API. And then I got into these all kinds of wild dreams about how to actually start solving the problem in a kind of a more API way. I even kind of thought about making a mock API that would answer these questions. And I actually played around with some stuff and Postman, and then I stopped myself because I was like, no, this is getting too nerdy on the subject. But the point is that the data, because of human beings writing all kinds of stuff, it's a little bit messy, but you can get to some kind of categories of questions. The problem with Stack Overflow is that the questions really are not basic level questions that are there, mostly due to kind of who uses Stack Overflow, but also there are kind of the basic questions are more down to specific coding issues with APIs and Open API, rather than, these a little bit more philosophical questions, which were a little bit more findable in Twitter and possibly some other places. So it's kind of this, data science issue almost, or human language problem. But it is doable. But then there's just a raw approach to just pick what looks good and simplify from the first questions to a more generic questions to get the first kind of 10 questions. And that is, of course, totally doable with kind of more or less work. But to go deeper into that, that would be kind of a bigger stuff if looking at those questions, because they are not really good data for the basic stuff.
Yeah, interesting. So you think Twitter is a place we can find where the more simple questions are going to be, or do you think?
Yeah, there are like two total extremes there. So there's like the very basic questions from like total newbies, and then there are like super philosophical questions from all the guys working on all kinds of fancy standard stuff. But I think that's kind of the thing. And in Stack Overflow, people are really going to the kind of technical stuff, and plus everybody in Stack Overflow is calling still OpenAPI Swagger, by the way.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of those findings.
Yeah, that's a serious challenge. Well, I have a Twitter collection, a Postman collection that pulls the OpenAPI Swagger hashtags from the Twitter API, and I aggregate those and kind of curate and look through them. That's how I kind of watch the space. I was thinking about doing the same for Stack Overflow, and then curating them, and then you got to curate them and then adding them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've used Zapier and stuff for Twitter for like the hashtag things, and of course Postman is there, but with Stack Overflow, it's a little bit more tricky problem for this particular topic.
Yeah,
I would say.
Well, where do you think we could encourage? I mean, I guess maybe on Twitter we could start asking some basic questions. I'm trying to think of how to incentivize people to teach them where to ask questions.
Yeah, I was actually having exactly that idea, which kind of took me to that kind of weirder direction, but I was exactly thinking that kind of more of a chatbot-y style, like ask question and someone, human or otherwise, will answer to this. But in case of this, of course, it needs to first be a human so that we can get quality answers. But yeah, I was going for that, and I was thinking that the 30-second videos, and with using even the Twitter kind of survey stuff, might encourage people to kind of ask more things.
Interesting. Twitter survey. I like that. Yeah, so just to recap for everybody and people joining on the video, it was recommended last week that we, the purpose of this group is to kind of ideate and come up with ways that we can generate more demand for OpenAPI, but wider specifications, and we had a lot of ideas around education and creating training, but we kind of have the problem of like, how do we get there? How do we get to a full blown where we have OpenAPI, async API, training, education, curriculum, classes, workshops? But you almost got to like start with the basics. Like, what are the questions that should be on as part of the curriculum, and how do we make sure people get their questions answered? And so we created a new project here, and we're adding questions as GitHub issues, and then we're answering them, and we're still playing with this format. That's why I kind of jumped at the first two questions and just kind of came up with a basic format for publishing them to YouTube, and then I tweet them out on my Twitter account. But as was just discussed, that let's try. I'm going to try to keep it down to 30 seconds. I'm going to keep refining that process. But we'd love to figure out how to get this filled with questions, and then start using labels to kind of organize them by basic, advanced, maybe specification, OpenAPI versus async, and then figure out how to get more people asking questions and get more people answering questions, and then work to kind of curate this. And we could see this evolving into what ends up becomes a curriculum or a set of workshop and materials. Is, hey, these are actually what people need to know when it comes to learning OpenAPI or learning async API. So that's just kind of a recap of how we got here. So
basically
go ahead.
Basically we should then start adding kind of and of course more people could join in, but just adding the other specs questions here too. And we could actually start kind of, if we kind of mentally aim to have the first 10 still, so kind of have what is an open API, what is an async API, like the obvious ones, and then kind of what's the difference between this and that. So we could start from, that kind of way to get the first 10 ones and focus more on producing a little bit of a content and get it started out in Twitter, and then kind of focus on getting it a little bit viral so that people would start asking the questions. So I think that would be then a good approach now that we have much more of those specs. But that's just my take on this.
Agreed. I'll keep adding questions here. I'm going to spend another chunk of time today doing that, just based upon what I know and what I encounter in conversations with folks and workshops I do. One question I have for this group is, and you alluded to looking at Stack Overflow, is how do we address the people not understanding the difference between Swagger and OpenAPI? How do we do it in a way that's not shaming and mean and it's supportive? What are some? I'd love to hear more ideas about how we help people know to ask questions the right way, but also just understand what's going on.
I try to just point out that Swagger is actually a brand name owned by Smart Bear now.
Yeah.
And so just mention that, for that reason alone, we should just avoid using that term.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that.
I got a question for the group. This is Dave. Would it make sense for us to put together some sort of way that's easy for folks to test the spec?
Yeah.
You mean validate if it's valid, or if understanding why you might be asking this, but understanding if the API is kind of doing what it's supposed to be doing according to the specs. I mean, what are you kind of thinking here?
Yeah, that's what I mean. How do you know that Swagger is building the right spec or API?
Yeah, so I would love to figure out, several different ways of doing this. I think this goes into the governance landscape, for me, is how do you not just test an API implementation, but test the design of an API? And definitely that's a pretty critical subject right now. I know Phil has, and Stoplight has their Specky rules engine. So that speaks to that. And then I'm doing work at Postman as well. So yeah, I would love to explore that.
Dave, just to understand the question better, do you mean to validate syntax of valid OpenAPI documents? Or do you mean here's an already valid OpenAPI document, here's an API that it's supposed to describe, how do we make sure it describes the API in the right way? It's two different things.
Yeah, so I have some background noise here, but there's an echo. What I'm talking about is it just a validated OpenAPI document? Period. Not about whether it's going to work or not with yours.
There's validators out there. What I think is hasn't happened yet. We don't have like a public validator that it might be easy to throw a document against and say, okay, this is valid OpenAPI, this is good to go. Regardless of whether it has best practices or good governance or good taste even. It's just a valid specification document. I think that could be a public service, either API or some hosted service that one of us sponsors. The other thing that I've been proposing is GitHub badges that you could put on your repo that this validator makes sure that they're up to date.
Yeah, it seems like unless it's an open source tool, how would you even know that it's doing it correctly?
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo.
Yeah, there's an echo on yours, Emmanuel, when you're
Okay.
on it. Oh. Everyone's
Dave, I noticed you're seemingly logged into two devices.
I think there's a echo when you're on your mic's on, Emmanuel.
Okay, I'll fix that.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I have to say, I mean, like in API management solutions, typically there is a validation, like a runtime validation on how the API implements, like because in most API management solutions, you publish the Open API or RAML spec, and then on runtime, it's being validated, and part of it is just pure kind of JSON, for example, validation, because it's, of course, let's say it's a JSON format spec, and then you kind of validate if the incoming JSON or outcoming JSON is valid according to that. So that's a very easy one. And then, of course, there are other kind of testing approaches to that, but to have kind of a compliance style validation, let's say, to the API so that it meets certain design criteria, or, for example, that if your organization requires that you should have, for example, authentication or security or certain other segments kind of in that API spec, that is, well, probably, I've seen some libraries, but I mean, like, that's also a little bit of company-specific stuff in some ways, but I don't know if this kind of goes to the direction.
So
By the way, I wasn't talking about security or even if it was like a quality API. I just mean purely, does it meet the spec? End of story.
Yeah, but then that's just the kind of JSON schema validation.
So
that is
that's all.
totally
That's all
standard.
an API is it JSON or not? That's all it is.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
it meets the JSON schema.
The most commonly tool out there is, unfortunately, something hosted by one of the member companies of OpenAPI Smartware. It's called Swagger Editor. You throw in a file and it returns you a bunch of errors. You can continue to edit it. That's what most people use as a very simple dumb test.
Well, but see, that's my point, is that you're trying to differentiate OpenAPI from Swagger, but Swagger is the authority as to whether or not it meets OpenAPI. So I think we got to fix that.
No,
exactly. There's a parallel effort by OpenAPI to do this kind of getting started guides, but I don't think it's going in that direction, which probably should.
So there's. Go ahead.
There's a repo, Open API Spec Validator, if somebody knows more about that, but that seems to be kind of doing exactly what somebody was asking here, or Dave was asking here, but I'll post it here.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty standard capabilities. I mean, Swagger Editor kind of opened, this up in real time, that as I type here, this is, if my screen's not frozen. Hello. Oh, I have the Kubernetes Open API in here, and it's like 1,500 paths, so it froze. So, anyways, Swagger Editor does that inline, and that was kind of the first. Hey, I'm validating this against the JSON schema for Open API, and making sure my Open API definition is valid. Let me give you an example of that. I hesitate going into Postman because I don't want this to be just a Postman conversation. But here's the Open API definition. You have the same validator that as I'm typing something, and I put in a new property that it's going to validate in real time against the Open API JSON schema and tell me whether this is valid or not. Now, at any point, I can do X dash, and then that will actually get me past the validation, and that's valid. So this is the valid Open API definition. Now, this, which uses JSON schema to validate. Now, this API itself has JSON schema for my API. Okay, so here's the actual products and a reference to my products, so that when I actually run this API and I get products, here's a list of products right here. I can then pull that open JSON schema from the open API and actually run it, validate it. I'm actually doing that with AJV here and pulling it. So here's the AJV validator down here, and I'm actually pulling the open API or the JSON schema from that open API and saying that is valid. Then there's a third dimension of validation that would go into governance, and I have to go to my governance workspace. Have to share this real quick because I wasn't ready. Share it back to my products workspace. Back to my products workspace. And then I can actually pull this open API here and instead test the surface area of this API to make sure it meets certain rules, like are all my parameters camel case in this, and go beyond what JSON schema, whoops, I have the wrong environment, and actually validate rules against and say, okay, are all of the parameters in this document camel case, and loop through it, and going beyond what JSON schema can do. So there's many dimensions to this conversation. JSON schema plays a central role at multiple levels, but then like this is what Specky does too. Specky goes beyond and allows you to create a set of rules that may or may not use JSON schema to validate, but it goes beyond that. Does that cover it?
I would have something to add to that, because that's kind of essentially in whatever test framework or spec framework like BDD or whatever I've done, for example, that there. But what needs to be considered is that while the API might meet the spec, the interesting question is the spec version. Because from real life, for example, different API management tools are using different versions of the spec. And for example, when 3.0 was like really kind of evolving, all the API management tools were kind of using some older version of the spec. And then even if your API was actually valid according to a validator, Swagger or something else, then it still wouldn't be valid according to that particular API management tool because it was using an older version. I had some fun with file uploads, for example, before they were really kind of getting implemented. That version of Open API 3 was implemented into all the products. So this is a very kind of, exactly as Kim said, there are so many layers to this, but this would be an internal style guide thing also, this what the spec and what you were showing here.
Yeah, and I agree that like you just got at the problem with tooling support for the versions. That's a serious problem, and this is one of the things, you know, when we first started the OAI and put it in there, put the spec in there, Tony was very against tooling being in there and didn't want to, you know, because that was the separation with Swagger. Swagger was the tooling. The brand stayed with the tooling, the spec left and became Open API. And so the OAI was meant to be around just specs. Now, if you talk to Fran of Async API, he feels very passionately that whoever governs the spec should also govern validators, generators, because they always have to be up to date. And then tooling providers should use that open source tooling to do it, because otherwise what you just said occurs, where you have different versions of the spec and the tooling hasn't caught up with it. But the problem is vendors aren't very good at this.
Yeah, so I mean, how do you know that one vendor's product works with another? I mean, isn't the whole open API thing not just to create great APIs, but also to make interoperability there, I would imagine?
Yeah, no, that's one of the issues or the ideas that was on the original home list is certification of tooling. One of them here, but is how do you validate that a service or an open source tool supports Open API spec, which version of the spec they support. But then you also have to get very detailed and say how, you know, which elements, like you can support version 3.1, but if you don't support, references and be able to spider external references, you're not fully supporting the spec. So that's part of we need to do a certification or badging to make sure. But then how do you test this and validate this? Is this a third party group? Do service providers self-certify? It's a big problem.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you almost want a kind of a service where you can validate your tool, which provides the test data for each of the versions, because otherwise it's going to be impossible if it's not automated.
I think maybe one way to handle this is do an event where you take an API generated by a tool, and then let's say many tools. Let's say you have multiple tools create an API, and then you have multiple competitor tools validate that API and see which ones break.
Yeah. Agreed.
I think that might stir up some energy.
The challenge is all those service providers have to have an API for their tools and services, which they don't all tend to have, which is like the original sin of API service providers. If you're selling tools and services to the API space, you should always have an API, because then now we can automate and someone can externalize. So I could use Stoplight, I could use Postman, I could use and execute that, and then show that as a set of test lists. Run that out nightly or daily, and show if anybody ever deviates from that. If a release breaks something. So yeah,
automation would be a goal. I think if there was really a need for this, but I think just doing it once would. I mean, if you want awareness, that'll certainly get people to pay attention.
Yeah.
Hey, you want to participate in this, or do you want to be left off of the certified list?
Yeah. No, and I would. Oh, go ahead, Marika.
Yeah, sorry. That's a great idea, but I think that one of the issues to avoid, that could actually solve even that problem. That there are still vendors, like super big vendors, who don't see the point in moving from OpenAPI 2.0 to 3.0, for example. I'm not even talking about those guys who don't see the value of OpenAPI in the first place, but I'm just saying. So, what maybe something like that would stir also the interest to that. But that's one of the questions that we should answer, that what's the point with 3.0, for example?
So, real quick, what is the point to move to 3.0? What is the value? Anybody have opinions?
The silence is deafening.
Well, I already opened my mouth in the beginning and said that, hey, finally the good stuff from RAML is in OpenAPI, but anybody else?
Yeah, the overlays coming is definitely going to be a big thing. I have a workshop with the RAML folks this week to kind of explore more of that difference, as well as what the future holds. I'll throw in, I would say
alignment with JSON schema is a
yeah. Well, RAML's a modeling. That's their strength. Is they say modeling is where that's the difference between them and OpenAPI. Is they're a modeling format, but we'll see. I would say from Swagger to OpenAPI, the components is one of the big ones. The sprawl that you have, your API operations, the sprawl that you have for the design patterns. Like if you're going to pull together governance and start using common patterns across your API, you need to have a way to centralize those within file, having one file that is, hey, here's the common components we're using across this API. And so developers don't have to do all of the hard work of the redundant work of this parameter goes here, it's the same parameter across all, query exists all universally. Let's just centralize that and use a reference. And then graduating to, okay, well, how do we centralize those components from a governance? So I would say just being more organized, that's one of the big features.
For me, I like the addition of links in OpenAPI 3. We use Hypermedia, Helios APIs, so it's important for us to be able to document the links. And prior to 3.0, we had to use extensions x dash things to document links, and now we can actually put it into the spec, and the tools can take advantage of that. The other major benefit of 3 is the ability to document different types of responses based on media types. So you have your response content, and you can have for media type A, it looks like this. For media type B, it looks like that. That was really important. It doesn't go quite as far as I wanted. If you go back to issue 110 in the spec on GitHub, you'll find there's a long history of people wanting OpenAPI to be a little bit more flexible in how you structure it. But it is an improvement in 3.0 to be able to have multiple responses and also have multiple examples on an operation or on a schema. So those are some really nice benefits that are in.
The other couple of things are some elements of reusability and componentization, where you can create like security components and use them throughout. And also the ability to specify multiple target hosts that are used by the tooling. So there's not just one host path, but multiple sets of these with templating, with mustache variables.
Yeah, good examples, you guys.
And that last one is one that really needs some better documentation and examples of how to use that particular feature. It's very obscure in the specification itself. It's kind of hard to understand how one really uses that, but it's important if you're trying to define an API that you want to actually have it go through dev, test, prod environments and things like that. Being able to specify different servers for different purposes is useful. It's not documented very well. It's kind of a confusing thing.
But to summarize, which was kind of my nasty point about the RAML, but exactly that what you all said, that the better support for productization and data kind of format examples, developer experience in a whole, and also kind of the governance side and life cycle. So I would say that finally we are in the kind of level with 3.0 where we start to treat API as a proper kind of governed productized product, and to think about the developer experience, especially when people are using it for testing or for documenting the API.
Yeah, all really good reasons. This is good. This is more like what I was trying to flesh out as part of my Swagger 2.0 to the Open API conversations, to kind of start building some of these cases. I think especially for public APIs, if you're going to be launching a public API and you're using Swagger, I think or you're saying Swagger, I think the IP, the intellectual property aspect of that is probably one of the strongest arguments that we can make. But then, going down through, the componentization and talking about each componentization opportunity, security, parameters, responses, thinking about the links and the hyperlinks now, and being able to, the beginnings of the hypermedia, the multiple responses for media types, the multiple examples, the hosts with templating and variables. I think that there's just a lot more there. That's some pretty good meat on the bone. Thank you, guys. All right, so back to questions. I'm curious how, and Dave, maybe we can cover this when we talk financial specs. I want to start putting industry level stuff in here, and not just Open API. This is kind of why we've got the big tent now. Is I want it to just be about API specs, so that I can do, because I'm working on a validation kind of sandbox for fire specification right now. I'm going to be talking with Dave later about financial. I've got a few I talked to European banking folks earlier this week, and creating basically what we just went through around spec validation. So is it a valid Open API spec? And then what are some basic governance rules to make sure that it follows it for a specific industry? And so should we be starting this Q&A more simply? I lost my question repo here. should we just keep this around OpenAPI and async in the core specs, or do you think it'll muddy it if we do questions beyond about financial specs or PSD2 or Fire, or what are your thoughts, Ini? No opinions?
I have a vague opinion, but I think that, well, of course it can model it, but on the other hand, there is an ongoing discussion on, for example, Fire and OpenAPI on the healthcare cycle, and I think that at least on a basic level, those questions should be answered, because of course when you get to open banking and you get to the healthcare, the kind of real answers, the deep down answers start getting very, very kind of complex. But on a very simple level, those answers could be included to kind of also draw more wider audience.
Agreed. All right. What else? What else you guys interested in talking about today? Any particular project we should dive into? Any other areas from the toolbox? How can we get more people to this group? I would say we had an initial burst, and then some people fell to the wayside, whether it was the format I was doing earlier on or just people being busy. You guys have any ideas for? I think now being a kind of bigger tent is going to help me because I can get GraphQL conversations here, async conversations. Any other thoughts on how we can get people here talking? Nope. Well, I will keep brainstorming on that because that's I think more voices as part of this is going to be pretty critical, but I'm not too worried about it. I think I'm going to, not in this working time, but I'm going to go back to some of the other projects and specifically keep reaching out to service providers and tooling providers and get them here. But I think I want to really keep focusing on the Swagger conversation and get people. That's a big part of it. But I don't, in doing API evangelism over the last 10 years, like, people don't always want to talk about the mundane, boring things. They want to talk about what's new. So maybe async API conversations would get people more excited. GraphQL seems to get a core group excited. Wonder if we talk more forward thinking, or if we, answering the mundane questions that people are wanting to know, like about validation, about the basic fundamental things, about the Swagger to OpenAPI, if that's going to get people here. Any thoughts on, should we work on the hard mundane, or should we talk about the sexy future stuff?
It's always hard to the sexy new stuff. There's always, it's always going to be there, and it always generates more interest from people if that's purely what we're after. But I think the hard questions here are in the not too shiny stuff. I think we've established this here in this group. It pulls in more people to talk about the shiny stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is both. I mean, from my perspective, is we need to find that mix, and so I'm going to work on that. I think the questions, I think Maruka's suggestion last week to do this, I think is pretty significant. I think it could be our leading indicator, and back to one of your ideas, Emmanuel, around how do we measure success. I think by asking questions and getting people to answer them, or finding what questions people have and what are the popular answers, I think a lot of this can feed into, we can track metrics. What do people care about? What are people's problems? And I'm really looking to crack that nut of, when I'm in the conversation with someone that's saying Swagger and is all in on Swagger, and they don't really get the Open API, like, what is the thing that makes them go, Is that shaming them because they're on an old spec? Is it, showing them the shiny new tooling that you can do with OpenAPI 3 and finding that thing that gets them to switch? So I think that's the biggest hard question, the non-sexy shiny question that's on the table.
Did Frank have something to say? Because I think you put your mic on, and then I have a comment too.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm really here in listening mode, but generating I think going back to one of the questions, and I think maybe somebody mentioned it about if you have a start with the knowledge base of simple questions for the newbies, or maybe making it slightly more invested, and creating a bit of hype in parallel, you could already have a bot sitting in front of the questions, which would maybe field the answers for newbies on the different social media platforms, like for Twitter, for example. If people want to ask a question about OpenAPI spec, you can interact with a bot that's maybe provided by this community group or whomever, which would fall back on that Q&A knowledge base repository that you're building up, could politely answer upon the Swagger question. So when you said Swagger, maybe I think you mean OpenAPI spec, and then bring them to prompt them to say, did they really cognitively mean OpenAPI versus Swagger? And then if you ask a question that you can't find, then maybe it puts a question on the issue list to be moderated by this group, and then actually answer that question, which becomes a self-professing bot. You could also then hook it up with maybe the Twitter APIs, etc., going out, picking up on references to Swagger, and maybe introducing itself to people who are still talking about Swagger and saying, hey, I am now the knowledge base for OpenAPI spec. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's just maybe a fun idea.
That was my kind of secret Twitter chatbot kind of automation idea, mainly that something like that could also work. But good that you brought that up. And I have to answer to the sexy stuff. So actually what I think is that to bring those kind of newer and sexier topics to the table in a smart way could be a good thing, because a lot of times with those new formats, new technologies, there is the problem of they haven't really thought or stumbled upon the kind of the governance or the validations or the API management stuff, for example, that has already been there with that kind of older stuff. And some of the same questions, like we are seeing with REST API and GraphQL, for example, all the same stuff and then more is coming up when you start talking about GraphQL API management versus REST API management. The problematic question is that the tool vendors, for example, often have a kind of an issue with talking about these newer things or different things than REST APIs. 1 year ago, it used to be even worse, but it's still a bit there because there are different tools handling these different stacks most of the time. But I think that's still the interesting bit. It's still the thing that would kind of draw people to have a conversation around it. So
I think Frank touched on a really critical point of the reinforcement, inline reinforcement of, hey, this is OpenAPI. Hey, there's a whole bunch of knowledge about OpenAPI here, because the knowledge on Swagger is static and not changing. So the knowledge and information on OpenAPI is evolving. That's, I think, a very important one.
Ken, you're muted.
Oh. God dang it. Dang it. Sorry about that. That was a good thing I said. You guys missed it. Sorry. I'm not going to say it again. No. What Frank said was very important. I think there's a very critical piece of that is the reinforcement of Swagger inline on Twitter. When people are talking about Swagger, that we say, hey, did you mean OpenAPI? And look, here's the answer to your question over here. And showing them that the knowledge around Swagger is static, not changing, and then in a friendly inline way make the connection to OpenAPI with some value that, hey, there's more knowledge. There's an expanding knowledge base over here of Open API, and you should be part of that. And if you just use the right words, this knowledge would come to you via this Twitter bot. I like that. Yeah, I'm gonna think more about the bot aspect of this. I think, as Maruka said, in the early days, we're gonna have to perform the role as of bots because it won't be very smart, and depending on how we build it, what technology we use. But if we could emulate bot-like behaviors and answer people's questions, and then really bridge that divide between Swagger and Open API and look at what are questions people are asking on Twitter about Swagger. How do we help them? Like maybe bring a couple of the questions up in this group. I'll try to get a few into GitHub issues for next week. Talk about how this question they asked, how can we respond to that in an Open API way that answers their questions, but yet educates them and introduces them to Open API, and then shows them there's more value if they use that word. So this is a behavioral adjustment in people in real time on Twitter. Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to conclude. No need to start up a new topic in the last 5 minutes here. But unless anybody else has anything to throw onto that, I'll open up the floor. Looks like your mic's open, Frank. You got something to say?
Oh, sorry, it's open accidentally. No, good session. Happy to be here, and hopefully I can contribute something moving forward.
Cool. Well, we appreciate you being here. Thank you. I'm going to spend some more time on the question part. I'm also, as I said, I'm going to be spending more on the industry and the multiple specs, because that was the main motivation, was to make this a more inclusive conversation to the async and GraphQL folks. And so I'm going to work on the industry and the multi-spec over the next week. And then look forward to seeing you guys all next week, and we can keep talking about this. I appreciate you guys making the time, and I appreciate your participation on the GitHub repo. And again, I apologize for the org change, but it will stay constant now, and we'll just keep plowing forward. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day, or have a good weekend. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.